The sky over Dust Anchor was a bruised expanse of indigo and rust, a perpetual dusk that never quite surrendered to the night. For Elias Vance, this was the only time the world made sense. At 45 years old, his body was a map of the long war, etched in the stiffness of his gait and the white lines of scar tissue that ran across his ribs. He sat on the rusted chassis of a harvester, a Viber echo sensor pressed against the cold metal. The machine hummed, a low rhythmic thrum that told him the internal gears were grinding into fine powder. "Dust Anchor eats everything," Elias muttered, his voice a dry rasp. "Steel, memories, and men." He tightened a bolt with a heavy wrench, his knuckles white. Out here on the edge of the rust sands, he was supposed to be a ghost. The iron orbit hegemony didn't look for retired strategists in the graveyard of the galaxy. They only cared about the quotas of silicate and the ghost dust his farm produced to fuel their jump drives. The wind began to pick up, carrying the scent of ionized air and ancient ozone. Elias checked his wrist comp. 1,700 hours. Lyra and Miri were late. They had gone into Blackwell trading posts to swap refined crystals for medical filters and protein bricks. It was a 3-hour journey in the rover, and they should have crested the Iron Ridge 60 minutes ago. A flicker of cold anxiety, a sensation he hadn't felt since the Cygnus massacre, pricked at the base of his neck. He stood up, his joints popping in protest. He scanned the horizon through his ocular implant, a piece of illegal ghost gear that filtered the shimmering dust to show heat signatures. Nothing. Only the endless, shifting dunes of the sand sea. Then a sound, not the low growl of their rover's electric motor, but a high-pitched, desperate whine, an engine being pushed past its red line. Elias dropped the wrench. He didn't run. He moved with the calculated speed of a man who knew that panic was a luxury for the dead. He reached into the hidden compartment of his harvester and pulled out an M9 Gauss rifle. It was a relic, a forbidden weapon of the Terran vanguard. But in the fringe, the law was only as strong as your firing pin. The rover skidded over the ridge, its tires kicking up a massive plume of glowing dust. It slammed into the perimeter pylon of the farm, the metal screeching in agony. Elias was there before the dust settled, the rifle leveled at the windshield. "Out! Now!" he barked, the voice of the strategist returning to him like a haunting. The door hissed open. Lyra tumbled out, her face streaked with sweat and terror. Her sister Miri followed, clutching her side. But they weren't alone. Between them, they were dragging a third figure, a tall, slender humanoid wrapped in a scorched flight suit. Elias's finger tightened on the trigger. The reticle in his eye flared red as it identified the target. Species, Oryx. Classification, enemy combatant. The woman's fur was the color of fresh snow, matted now with dark, violet blood. Her ears, large and pointed, were pinned flat against her skull. She had a tail, a long, elegant brush of white, that trailed in the dirt. Her eyes, golden wide with shock, found Elias's face. "Dad, don't!" Lyra screamed, throwing herself between the rifle and the stranger. "She saved us! The hegemony dogs! They cornered us at the well. They were going to take the rover. They were going to take us. Get away from it, Lyra!" Elias's voice was ice. "That's an Oryx. You don't know what they are. They don't save people. They infiltrate. They destroy." "She did, Dad," Miri sobbed, her hands covered in the stranger's violet blood. "She blew the steam lines in the market. She gave us a chance to bug out. They shot her with a phase bolt. We couldn't leave her. We couldn't let them finish her off." Elias looked at the stranger. She was slumped against the rover's tire, her breathing a shallow, wet rattle. There was no weapon in her hands, only a small crushed flower from the desert floor. She looked at Elias, and for a heartbeat, he saw a flicker of recognition in those gold eyes. Not the hatred of a soldier, but the weary silence of a victim. "The hegemony is hunting her," Elias said, his tactical mind mapping the consequences. "If they track her here, they'll burn this farm. They'll take you to the chrono cages. Do you understand the risk you brought home?" "We understand," Lyra said, her jaw set in the same stubborn line as her father's. "But we're Vances. We don't owe our lives to anyone without paying it back. You taught us that, didn't you? Or was that just another lie from the war?" Elias felt the sting of her words. He looked at the Oryx woman. She coughed, a spray of violet mist hitting the sand. "One night," Elias growled, lowering the rifle but not engaging the safety. "We patch her up, we hide the rover in the Shield Bay, and at dawn she's gone. If I see a single signal flare or a hidden transmitter, I'll space her myself. Are we clear?" "Clear," the girls whispered. Elias looked at the horizon. Far in the distance, the blue strobe lights of Iron Orbit patrol drones were already beginning to sweep the Iron Ridge. The hunt had begun, and Dust Anchor was about to become a very small world. The workshop smelled of grease, old copper, and the sweet metallic scent of Oryx blood. Elias had cleared a space behind the half-gutted frame of a scout cutter, setting up a medical cot. He worked in silence, his hands moving with the practiced, detached efficiency of a field medic. He had seen these wounds before, the charred edges of a phase bolt hit. It didn't just burn, it disrupted the cellular structure, preventing natural regeneration. "You're going to need a biosuture," Elias said, not looking at the woman's face. "And the numbing agent I have is designed for human nervous systems. It might make you hallucinate. It might stop your heart. Choice is yours." The Oryx woman, whose name he still didn't know, nodded once. "I have survived the Void Trench, human. Your medicine will not be my end." Her voice was like silk sliding over gravel, melodic, but carrying a heavy resonance. Elias pressed the injector against her neck. She didn't scream, but her claws dug into the metal frame of the cot, leaving deep grooves in the alloy. Her tail lashed once, then went limp as the chemicals hit her system. "Lyra, go to the house. Watch the long-range sensors. If anything larger than a sandmouse pings the perimeter, you tell me," Elias ordered. "Miri, get the thermal blankets. She's losing heat." As his daughters hurried to comply, the workshop became a cavern of shadows. Elias began to excise the necrotic tissue. It was intimate, grim work. To save her, he had to touch her, feeling the strange, dense musculature under her fur, the heat radiating from her skin. It felt like a betrayal of every man he'd lost at Cygnus. "Why did you do it?" Elias asked suddenly, his voice low. "Why help two human sector rats? Your kind hates us. We broke your world." The woman's eyes fluttered open, the gold dimmed by the drug. "The war, it was a long time ago, Elias Vance." Elias froze. He hadn't told her his name. He hadn't told anyone his full name in 10 years. "How do you know who I am?" he hissed, leaning in, his hand hovering near the scalpel. "The way you move," she whispered, her head lolling back. "The way you look at the shadows as if they are enemy positions. My father told me about the ghost of Sector 4, the man who fought with logic instead of rage. He said you were the only human who ever understood the cost of a bullet." "Your father was a fool if he thought I was anything but a killer," Elias replied, his heart hammering. "Who was he?" "General Thorne," she murmured. The name hit Elias like a physical blow. General Thorne, the Oryx commander who had tried to negotiate a ceasefire at Cygnus. The man Elias had been ordered to eliminate during the parley to ensure the hegemony could seize the mines. Elias had fired the shot from 2 kilometers away. He had watched through the scope as the general fell, and the peace died with him. "You're Calith," Elias breathed, the realization chilling his blood. "The daughter." "I am," she said, a ghost of a smile touching her black lips. "And I did not save your daughters by accident, Elias. I have been looking for you for a very long time. Not for blood, but for the truth." Before Elias could respond, the workshop's comms unit let out a sharp, jagged burst of static. Lyra's voice came through, frantic and breathless. "Dad, the hegemony dogs! They aren't just patrolling. They've landed a Harrower-class transport at the gate. Overseer Drax is on the speaker. He says he knows we have contraband on the premises. He's giving us 3 minutes to open the shield wall, or he's going to level the house." Elias looked at Calith. She was pale, her energy spent, her wound only half closed. Then he looked at the door leading to his daughters. The past was no longer an echo. It was a battering ram at his front door. "Get up!" Elias growled, grabbing his rifle. "If you want the truth, you're going to have to live long enough to hear it. Lyra, Miri, get to the scout cutter. We're going hot." The quiet life of a scavenger was over. The strategist was back, and this time he wasn't fighting for a corporation or a crown. He was fighting for the only things left in the galaxy that weren't for sale. The scout cutter groaned, a sound of stressed titanium and dying servos that echoed through the cramped cabin like a terminal cough. Outside the reinforced viewports, the jagged obsidian walls of the mist canyons blurred into a streaking mess of shadow and bioluminescent fog. Elias Vance kept his hands locked on the flight yoke, his knuckles standing out like white stones under his weathered skin. His ocular implant hummed, a high-pitched whine in his inner ear that signaled the system was redlining, trying to process the erratic magnetic fluctuations of the canyon floor. "Temperatures spiking in the secondary manifold," Lyra shouted from the engineering pit. Her voice was tight, the sharp edge of panic smoothed over by the mechanical focus he had drilled into her since she was 5 years old. "Dad, the harvester's engine wasn't meant to pull this kind of thrust. We're going to melt the stabilizers before we even clear the glass planes." "Keep it together, Lyra," Elias grunted, wrestling with a violent shudder that nearly tore the yoke from his grip. "Feed the emergency coolant into the intake. I don't care if we burn the seals, just give me 5 more minutes of level flight." "We're leaking atmosphere in the rear subdeck." Miri's voice came through the internal comms, sounding small and breathless. She was tucked into the narrow crawl space, her small hands fumbling with a patch kit. "The ghost dust is getting into the vents. It's starting to glow, Dad. It's beautiful, but I can't breathe." Elias swore under his breath. The ghost dust, the very thing that masked their heat signature from the iron orbit hegemony, was a double-edged sword. In high concentrations, the particulate was toxic to human lungs, a crystalline parasite that turned breathing into a slow, glittering suffocation. "Miri, get out of there," Elias commanded. "Seal the bulkhead and get to the cockpit, now." He glanced at the sensor display. A swarm of red dots was cresting the canyon rim behind them. Hegemony interceptors, fast, sleek, and hungry. They didn't have the heavy plating of his old Vanguard ships, but they had numbers, and they had the backing of a trillion credit corporation that viewed Dust Anchor as its private piggy bank. "Caleth," Elias said, his voice dropping to a low rumble. The Oryx woman was slumped in the navigator's seat, her silver fur matted with sweat and grime. She looked fragile, but her gold eyes were fixed on the navigation array with an intensity that bordered on the predatory. "You said you knew these canyons. Give me a way out that doesn't involve us becoming a smear on a rock face." Caleth's ears twitched, tracking a sound Elias couldn't hear. She leaned forward, her long, elegant fingers hovering over the holographic map. "The magnetic resonance is strongest 3 kilometers ahead. There is a fracture in the obsidian, a thermal vent the miners call the dragon's throat. If you can thread this needle, the heat bloom from the vent will mask our exit. But you must be precise, strategist. A deviation of 2 meters will result in our atoms being scattered across the sector." "Precision is my specialty," Elias said, though his heart felt like it was trying to punch through his ribs. "Lyra, dump the remaining ghost dust into the exhaust. We're going to create a blind spot." "Copy that, Dad. Ghost gear going hot." The scout cutter bucked as the canisters were jettisoned. A massive cloud of glowing indigo dust erupted behind them, turning the canyon into a shimmering tunnel of blue fire. The hegemony interceptors faltered, their sensors unable to penetrate the electromagnetic chaos. Elias slammed the throttle forward, the harvester's engine let out a final, screaming protest, and they dived into the narrow crack of the dragon's throat. The heat hit them instantly. The cockpit glass turned a dull, angry orange as they plummeted through a column of superheated gas. The ship rattled so violently that Elias felt the fillings in his teeth vibrate. Then, with a sudden, jarring lurch that threw Miri against the bulkhead, they punched through the other side. The silence was absolute. They were drifting a few meters above the glass plains, a vast, flat expanse of silica that reflected the twin moons of Dust Anchor like a frozen sea. The canyons were behind them, a wall of black stone guarding their escape. Elias exhaled a breath that tasted like ozone in old coffee. He let go of the yoke, his hands trembling with a sudden, violent adrenaline crash. "Status," he rasped. "Engines slagged," Lyra said, climbing out of the pit. She was covered in oil, her face smudged with black grease. "We aren't going anywhere until I can scavenge a new cooling loop and rebuild the fuel injectors. We're a sitting duck on a very shiny pond, Dad." "Miri?" Elias asked, turning his chair. The younger girl was sitting on the floor, her eyes wide as she watched the ghost dust settle on her sleeve. It pulsed with a faint, rhythmic light, mirroring her own heartbeat. I'm okay. It stopped glowing. I think, I think the ship likes me, Dad. It stopped leaking the moment I touched the seal. Elias shared a look with Caliph. The Oryx woman was watching Mary with an expression of profound sadness. It's not the ship, little bridge, Caliph whispered. Her voice was melodic, but it carried a weight that made the air in the cabin feel heavy. The ghost dust responds to life force, to the resonance of the starkin. You didn't just fix the seal, you willed it to hold. Mary looked at her hands, then back at Caliph. The starkin. You mean the experiment? The thing that makes us monsters? Not monsters, Caliph said, reaching out a hand, her claws retracted. She hesitated, then lightly brushed a strand of hair from Mary's forehead. Bridges. The hegemony saw only a weapon, but my father saw a future. A way for our two species to understand each other without the need for scopes and triggers. You are the harmony that the galaxy tried to scream into silence. Elias stood up, the stiffness in his back a sharp reminder of his age. He walked to the storage locker and pulled out a ration brick, tossing it to Lyra. Eat. We've got 4 hours of darkness before the hegemony recalibrates their satellites. Lyra, start on the engine. Use whatever you can strip from the life support backups. We can survive on thin air for a while, but we can't survive a squad of overseers. What about you? Lyra asked, catching the brick. She looked at him, her eyes searching. The revelation of her identity was still a raw wound, a question mark hovering over the only life she had ever known. Are you going to tell us the rest? About the stasis pods? About why you kept us in the dirt for 10 years? Elias leaned against the bulkhead, the cold metal biting through his tactical vest. He looked at Caliph, who was waiting for his answer with the patience of an ancient forest. I was a strategist, Elias began, his voice sounding distant even to himself. I saw the galaxy as a series of vectors and casualty rates. When I found those pods at Cygnus Prime, I didn't see a project. I didn't see bridges. I saw 2 children who were scheduled to be erased because the project had been deemed a liability. The hegemony realized that a bridge between species would make the war impossible to sustain. If soldiers could feel the pain of their enemies, they wouldn't pull the trigger. And the hegemony thrives on the profit of every bullet fired. He paused, the memory of the burning lab flickering in his mind. I took you because I wanted to win one battle that didn't involve a body count. I thought if I could give you a normal life, a life of grease and dust and moisture farming, maybe I could balance the ledger for the men I killed. For your father, Caliph. Kui. The silence that followed was suffocating. Caliph stood up, her white fur glowing in the dim emergency light. She walked toward Elias, stopping only inches from him. She was taller than him, a regal silhouette that reminded him of the general she had lost. The ledger is never balanced, Elias Vance, Caliph said, but it can be closed. You saved the bridges, but now you must help them cross. The high relay is the only way. My father died holding the keys to the truth. If we do not reach that transmitter, his death and your exile will have been for nothing. I know the way to the relay, Elias said, his eyes hardening, but the glass planes are infested with scavengers and hegemony outposts. We can't fly. We'll have to move on foot across the silica. On foot, Lyra exclaimed. That's 50 kilometers of open ground. We'll be picked up by thermal scans in 20 minutes. Not if we move during the ghost storms, Mary said suddenly. She was looking out the viewport at the horizon, where the purple sky was beginning to churn with a familiar electric energy. The storms are coming. I can hear them singing. They're loud tonight, loud enough to drown out everything. Elias looked at his youngest daughter. She was standing with a poise that was far beyond her 13 years, her head tilted as if listening to a distant choir. For the first time, he didn't see just a child he had rescued. He saw a star kin. He saw the bridge. All right, Elias said, checking the charge pack on his Gauss rifle. Pack light, rations, water filters, and every EMP grenade we have left. We move when the first bolt hits the planes. As they prepared to leave the safety of the ship, Elias felt a strange, terrifying sensation. For 10 years, he had been a man waiting to die, a relic of a war that wouldn't let him go. But as he watched Lyra skillfully strip a component from the engine, and Miri calmly organized their medical supplies. He realized he wasn't just a veteran anymore. He was a father leading his family into the fire. And as the first crack of ion thunder rolled across the glass plains, Elias Vance realized that for the first time in his life, he wasn't afraid of the dark. He was the one carrying the light. The hatch of the scout cutter hissed open, and the air of dust anchor rushed in, biting cold and smelling of salt and static. They stepped out onto the glass plains, their boots crunching on the silica that glittered like a million diamonds under the twin moons. The wind was howling now, a mournful, high-pitched song that signaled the arrival of the storm. "Keep close," Elias shouted over the roar of the wind. "If you lose the person in front of you, stay put and use your vibra echo. Don't wander. The plains are full of sinkholes that can swallow a rover whole." They moved in a single file, Elias in the lead, rifle swept across his chest, Miri and Lyra in the middle, and Calith bringing up the rear, her gold eyes scanning the horizon for the first sign of a hegemony flare. As the storm hit, the world disappeared into a swirl of white and indigo. The ghost dust rose from the ground in great, luminescent waves, obscuring their vision until they could barely see their own hands. But for Miri, the storm wasn't a barrier. She moved with a strange, liquid grace, her feet finding the solid ground with an intuition that made Elias's heart ache. She was leading them, though she didn't know it. Her hand was tucked into the crook of Elias's arm, her fingers pulsing with a faint blue light that seemed to calm the static around them. "You're doing great, kid," Elias whispered, though the wind snatched the words away. They had been walking for 3 hours when the first obstacle appeared. Not a hegemony squad, but something worse. A group of glass wraiths, scavengers who had spent too much time in the dust, their bodies warped by radiation and greed, their eyes replaced by glowing red sensors. They moved through the storm like ghosts, their silhouettes flickering in the indigo light. "Contact!" Elias hissed, dropping to one knee. "Lyra, Miri, behind the outcropping. Calith, cover the left flank." The wraiths didn't use rifles. They used long, jagged spears tipped with vibro blades, designed to pierce the plating of a harvester. There were 6 of them, circling the group with a predatory patience. "They want our gear," Lyra whispered, her hand going to the pulse pistol at her hip. "They don't care about the war. They just want the scrap." "Let them try," Calith snarled, her ears pinned back, her fur standing on end. She stepped forward, her hands glowing with an intense amber heat. "Wait," Miri said, stepping out from behind Elias. "They're not attacking. They're hurting. Miri, get back!" Elias reached for her, but she was already moving toward the lead wraith. The scavenger hissed, raising its vibro spear, the red sensor in its forehead pulsing with a malevolent light. But Miri didn't flinch. She reached out her hand, her palm flat, and touched the metal of the spear. A shock wave of blue light erupted from the point of contact. The wraith stumbled back, the red sensor in its head flickering, and then turning a soft, calm green. The other scavengers froze, their predatory stance dissolving into a confused, swaying silence. "The dust," Miri whispered, her voice carrying through the storm with an impossible clarity. "It's in their blood. They're part of the desert now. They just needed to remember how to breathe." The lead wraith lowered its spear. It let out a sound that wasn't a hiss, but a long, rattling sigh. Then, as quickly as they had appeared, the wraiths vanished back into the storm, leaving the group alone on the shimmering plains. Elias stared at his daughter, his rifle feeling heavy and useless in his hands. He had spent his entire life learning how to destroy enemies, how to map out kill zones and maximize casualties. He had never once considered that an enemy could be calmed, that a conflict could be resolved by a touch instead of a trigger. "What did you do, Miri?" Elias asked, his voice trembling. I felt their static," Miri said, looking down at her hands. "It was so loud, Dad. It was screaming. I just gave them a bit of my quiet." Calith walked over to Miri, her expression one of awe. "The Weaver's touch. My people have legends of it, but I have never seen it in the flesh. You are more than a bridge, Miri Vance. You are a sanctuary." Elias stood up, his mind racing. The hegemony wanted to turn these girls into soldiers. They wanted Lyra's mechanical intuition to build better weapons, and Miri's empathy to predict enemy movements. They wanted to weaponize the very things that made them human. "We have to keep moving," Elias said, his voice hard with a new kind of resolve. We're 20 kilometers from the relay. If the race can find us, Drax isn't far behind. As they pushed forward into the heart of the storm, Elias looked back at his daughters. He thought of the stasis pods at Cygnus Prime, the labels that called them medical waste. He realized then that he hadn't just saved 2 lives 10 years ago. He had saved the only thing that could actually end the war. Not a weapon, not a bomb, but the capacity for a second chance. And as the high relay station finally appeared on the horizon, a towering spire of steel and light stabbing into the indigo sky, Elias Vance knew that the long war was finally coming to an end. Not with a bang, but with the quiet strength of a bridge that refused to break. The high relay station sat upon the north pole of Dust Anchor, like a jagged crown made of chrome and arrogance. It was a masterpiece of iron orbit engineering, a 300-meter spire designed to pierce the planet's thick ionosphere and broadcast the hegemony's propaganda to the surrounding sectors. From its base, massive cooling vanes extended into the permafrost, glowing with a dull, rhythmic blue light that pulsed against the perpetual twilight. Elias Vance lay flat against a ridge of frozen silica, the cold of the ground seeping through his tactical vest. He adjusted the magnification on his ocular implant, his vision zooming in on the station's primary gate. 2 squads of overseers on the perimeter, Elias whispered, his voice barely audible over the low hum of the wind. 4 automated sentry turrets on the gantry, and that transport on the landing pad? That's Drax's personal ship. He's already inside. We can't just knock on the front door, Lyra muttered beside him. She was checking the calibration on the modified Viber Echo sensor, her brow furrowed in concentration. Those turrets are calibrated to track anything with a thermal signature higher than a rock. We'll be vaporized before we hit the first pylon. We're not going through the gate, Elias said, his eyes scanning the station's cooling vanes. The vents at the base of the vanes are oversized to account for the ion surges. If we can get close enough, we can climb the interior scaffolding. It'll lead us directly to the power core. Kalith shifted her weight, her silver fur blending into the glittering frost of the ridge. The climb will be dangerous, Elias. The vanes are electrified to prevent ice buildup. One wrong step, and we'll be cooked from the inside out. That's where Miri comes in, Elias said, turning to look at his younger daughter. Miri was sitting cross-legged, her eyes closed, her hands resting on the frozen ground. She seemed to be in a trance, her breathing synchronized with the rhythmic pulse of the station. Miri, can you feel it? Elias asked softly. Miri opened her eyes, her pupils wide and shimmering with a faint indigo light. The station is screaming, Dad. It's so full of static. But the cooling vanes, they have a rhythm. Every 40 seconds, the pulse drops to clear the sensors. That's our window. 40 seconds isn't much time to climb 20 meters of vertical scaffolding, Lyra said, biting her lip. It's all we have, Elias replied. He handed a coil of high-tensile climbing wire to Lyra. You and Kalith go first. I'll bring up the rear with the Gauss rifle. If we get spotted, I'll draw their fire while you 3 push for the transmitter. No, Kalith said, her gold eyes locking onto Elias's. We move as a pack, Elias. That is the Oryx way. If the hegemony takes one of us, they take us all. Elias felt a surge of something he hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of belonging. He had been a lone wolf for 10 years, a man who viewed everyone as either a target or a liability. But looking at this strange, broken family, he realized he wasn't alone anymore. All right, Elias said, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. As a pack, let's move. They descended the ridge, moving with a silent, synchronized grace. The storm had died down to a low, glittering mist, providing just enough cover to mask their approach. They reached the base of the first cooling vane, just as the blue light began to fade. Now, Miri whispered. They scrambled up the scaffolding, their movements frantic and precise. Elias could feel the static electricity dancing on his skin, the air around the veins smelling of ozone and burnt sugar. His joints ached with the effort, the phantom dampness of the trenches returning to haunt him. But he pushed through the pain, his eyes fixed on the shadow of his daughters above him. They reached the vent opening with 5 seconds to spare. As the cooling vane flared back to life with a deafening hum of blue energy, they tumbled into the dark, echoing interior of the station's substructure. The air inside was recycled and stale, a sharp contrast to the biting cold of the plains. It was a labyrinth of pipes, conduits, and humming servers, the nervous system of the hegemony's control over the sector. "Lyra, find us a terminal," Elias ordered, his rifle swept across the corridor. Lyra didn't need to be told twice. She found a maintenance port near a primary data trunk and jacked in her scavenged data pad. Her fingers flew across the screen, a blur of motion as she bypassed the station's initial firewalls. "I'm in," she whispered, "but the high relay is locked behind a chrono key. I can't broadcast the data shard without an administrative override. And the only person with that key is—" "Drax," Elias finished. "He's in the observation deck," Kayla said, her ears twitching. "I can hear his voice. He's talking to the orbital command. They're preparing to glass the sector, Elias. They've decided that the risk of the star kin escaping is greater than the value of the mines. They're going to erase everything. The farm, the town, the people, just to keep their secret." "Then we don't have much time," Elias said, his voice turning cold. "Kayla, take the girls to the transmitter room. Get the data shard ready. I'm going to get that key." "Dad, no!" Miri grabbed his arm. "He'll kill you. He has a whole squad of overseers with him." Elias knelt down, placing his hands on Miri's shoulders. He looked her in the eye, seeing the future that Kayla's father had dreamed of. "Miri, listen to me. I've spent 10 years trying to hide from what I am. But I realize now that I can't fix the past by running from it. I have to stand my ground. I have to be the strategist one last time so you can be the bridge. Do you understand?" Miri nodded, her eyes filling with tears. "Just come back, Dad. Please." "I'll be right behind you," Elias promised. He looked at Lyra. "Keep her safe, Lyra. Trust your instincts. You're a Vance. You don't break." "Neither do you, old man," Lyra said, her voice cracking. She leaned in and hugged him, a brief, fierce contact that felt like a blessing. Elias watched them disappear into the shadows of the ventilation shaft, Kalith leading the way with her silent, predatory grace. Then he turned toward the lift that led to the observation deck. He checked the charge on his Gauss rifle. 100%. The lift doors hissed open, revealing a panoramic view of the frozen North Pole. The twin moons were setting, casting long, pale shadows across the ice fields. In the center of the room stood Overseer Drax, his back to the door. He was a man of sharp angles and expensive fabric, a corporate shark in a world of sector rats. "I knew you'd come, Elias," Drax said, not turning around. His voice was smooth, a polished stone in a sea of gravel. "A strategist can't resist a high-stakes play. It's in your blood, isn't it? The need to be the hero in a story that's already been written." "The story is changing, Drax," Elias said, leveling his rifle. "Hand over the chrono key, and maybe I'll let the orbital command know you were a valiant casualty instead of a total failure." Drax turned around, a slow, mocking smile on his face. He held a small, glowing device in his hand, the chrono key. "You're a relic, Vance, a broken toy from a war that the galaxy has moved past. You think broadcasting a few files will change anything? The people don't want the truth. They want silicate and cheap energy. They want the stability the hegemony provides." "The stability of a graveyard," Elias countered. "Perhaps," Drax shrugged. "But a graveyard is a very quiet place, unlike your farm." He tapped a button on his wrist comp. From the shadows of the deck, 6 overseers stepped out, their plasma rifles leveled at Elias's chest. Their armor was reinforced with vibra-shields, the shimmering energy fields making them look like translucent ghosts. "Kill him," Drax said, his voice bored, "and bring me the Fox and the hybrids. I have a lab on the core world that's been waiting for fresh material." Elias dived behind a console just as the room erupted in a storm of plasma fire. The Gauss rifle kicked against his shoulder, the heavy slugs tearing through the consoles and shattering the panoramic glass. He moved with a ferocity that surprised even himself, his ocular implant feeding him a constant stream of tactical data. He saw the trajectories of the plasma bolts, the weak points in the Overseer's armor, the flicker of their shields. He wasn't a farmer anymore. He was the ghost of Sector 4. He tossed an EMP grenade, the blue-white flash short-circuiting the Overseer's HUDs and dropping their shields. In the split second of confusion, he surged forward, using his rifle as a club to shatter the visor of the nearest guard. He fired a point-blank shot that took the legs out from under the second, then rolled behind a pillar to avoid a return volley. "You're slowing down, Elias," Drax shouted, retreating toward the emergency exit. "The trenches took more out of you than you like to admit." "I'm fast enough for you," Elias roared, lunging through the smoke. He caught Drax just as the overseer reached the door. They collided, a tangle of limbs in desperation. Drax was younger, stronger, but Elias had the raw, ugly tenacity of a man who had survived the end of the world. They crashed against the edge of the observation deck, the broken glass of the viewport only inches away. Drax grabbed Elias's throat, his fingers digging into the scar on his neck. "You're a murderer, Vance. You killed General Thorne. You're no better than me." "I know!" Elias gasped, his vision blurring as the air was cut off. "That's why I'm the only one who can stop you." With a final, agonizing surge of strength, Elias drove his knee into Drax's ribs and slammed the overseer's hand against the metal railing. The chrono key flew from Drax's grip, skittering across the floor toward the lift. Elias didn't wait. He shoved Drax back and lunged for the key. He grabbed it just as the remaining overseers regained their footing and opened fire. A plasma bolt scorched his side, the heat blooming in his nerves like 1,000 needles. He fell into the lift, his fingers fumbling with the controls. The doors slammed shut just as a hail of fire hit the metal. Elias slumped against the back of the lift, his breathing a shallow, wet rattle. He looked down at the chrono key in his hand. It was glowing a steady, pulsing gold. "Pack, safe," he whispered, the darkness pulling at the edges of his vision. The lift ascended to the transmitter spire, the highest point on Dust Anchor. When the doors opened, Elias staggered out into the freezing wind. The spire was an open platform, surrounded by the swirling indigo of the ionosphere. In the center stood Kaleth, Lyra, and Miri, huddled around the primary broadcast array. "Dad!" Lyra screamed, running toward him. She caught him as his knees buckled, her hands staining red with his blood. "You're hurt. You're really hurt." "I'm fine," Elias lied, pressing the chrono key into her hand. "The key. Use it. Broadcast the shard." Kaleth took the key, her gold eyes filled with a profound respect. She slotted it into the array, and the station let out a deep, resonant chime that shook the very foundation of the spire. "It's working," Kaleth said, her voice sounding like a prayer. "The signal is piercing the ionosphere. Every relay in the sector is receiving the data. The project, the massacre, the truth, it's all out there now." The sky over Dust Anchor began to change. The indigo clouds shifted and parted, revealing a glimpse of the stars for the first time in 100 years. The ghost dust, reacting to the massive surge of energy from the broadcast, began to glow with an intense, brilliant white, turning the night into day. Miri stood at the edge of the platform, her arms wide, her white fur shimmering in the light. She wasn't just watching the light, she was part of it. The static of the planet was gone, replaced by a deep, harmonic song that resonated in everyone's bones. "The bridge is open," Miri whispered. Elias lay on the deck, his head pillowed in Lyra's lap. He looked up at the stars, the cold of the pole finally feeling peaceful instead of hostile. He saw the flickering lights of a dozen jump ships appearing in orbit, the neutral sector's fleet arriving to witness the fall of the hegemony. "We did it, Dad," Lyra sobbed, her tears hitting his cheek. "We're safe. Everyone's safe." Elias reached out a hand, his fingers brushing Miri's arm. "Not just safe, Lyra. Free." He looked at Kaleth, who was standing over him, her silhouette framed by the glowing sky. "I killed your father, Kaleth. Can you forgive a ghost?" Kaleth knelt down, her hand resting on Elias's chest. She leaned forward, her forehead touching his. "General Thorne didn't die for revenge, Elias Vance. He died for the future. And you gave it to him." As the light of the ghost dust filled the world, Elias Vance closed his eyes. The weight of the past was finally gone. The ledger was closed, and for the first time in 10 long years, the strategist of the Long War was at peace. On Dust Anchor, the wind was no longer a mournful song. It was a herald of a new dawn, and for the family he had chosen, the story was only just beginning. 50 kilometers away, in the town of Black Hollow, the people walked out of their homes, their faces upturned to the brilliant, white sky. They didn't see an enemy, They didn't see a corporation, and they didn't see a sector rat. They saw a bridge. And for the first time in a century, the people of the fringe began to sing along with the desert. The sky over the North Pole of Dust Anchor did not just part, it shattered. The brilliant white light of the ghost dust, supercharged by the high relays transmission, acted like a massive atmospheric lens. For the first time in over 100 years, the thick, toxic veil of the ionosphere was burned away, revealing a terrifyingly beautiful tapestry of stars. They were cold, distant, and numerous, diamonds scattered across a velvet abyss. To Elias Vance, lying on the deck plates with a plasma scorch eating into his side, they looked like the eyes of every man he had ever left behind. "Dad, stay with me! Don't you dare close your eyes!" Nah. Lyra's voice was a jagged thing, raw with the kind of terror that no amount of mechanical training could mask. She was pressing a thermal comp against his wound, her hands shaking so violently that the blue medical gel was smeared across his tactical vest. I'm just checking the weather, kid," Elias rasped, his breath hitching as a fresh wave of agony rolled through his nervous system. "Stars look clear today. Good for a long haul." "Don't talk that trash, old man," Lyra snapped, though her eyes were brimming with tears. "You're a strategist, remember. You don't get to check out until the mission is sector wash, and we are definitely not sector wash yet." She was right. High above, the flickering icons of jump ships began to resolve into solid heat signatures on the station's remaining displays. They weren't the blocky, brutalist shapes of the iron orbit hegemony. These were the sleek, predatory silhouettes of the neutral sector's coalition, a mixed species fleet of privateers, corporate rivals, and sovereign systems that had been waiting for a reason to break the hegemony's monopoly on ghost dust. The broadcast had given them more than a reason. It had given them a moral mandate. Kalith stood at the edge of the transmitter gantry, her silver fur illuminated by the starlight. She looked less like a saboteur and more like a vengeful deity of the Oryx myths. Her gold eyes were fixed on the descending landing craft. "The coalition is here," Kalith said, her voice carrying that melodic, haunting resonance. "But do not mistake their arrival for a rescue, Elias. They are here for the data shard. They are here for the Starkin. In the eyes of the galaxy, your daughters are not children. They are the most valuable pieces of military hardware ever conceived." Elias groaned, trying to push himself up. Miri was there instantly, her small hands bracing his shoulders. She was still glowing, a soft, pulsing indigo light that seemed to flow from her skin and into his. Where she touched him, the white-hot fire of the plasma burn dimmed into a dull, manageable ache. It was the Weaver's touch, the Starkin's curse and gift combined. "Miri, stop," Elias whispered, his voice cracking. You're draining yourself. You need that energy to stay stable." "I don't care about stable, Dad," Miri said, her jaw set. "I'm not letting the static take you. I'm giving you my quiet. Just take it." The sound of heavy repulsors began to drown out the wind. A massive white and gold frigate, the Accordant, dropped through the clouds, its docking claws extending like the talons of a hawk. It bypassed the main gate, hovering directly over the transmitter spire. A squad of Marines in high-vis tactical gear descended on fast ropes, their boots clanging against the metal gantry. At the lead was a woman Elias recognized from the orbital news feeds, Commander Sylvia Vane. She was a hard light veteran, her left arm a translucent blue prosthetic that hummed with kinetic energy. Behind her stepped a high exarch of the Oryx, a male with fur as black as coal and eyes that burned with a cold sapphire light. "Secure the perimeter," Vane barked, her hand resting on the hilt of a shock baton. "I want that transmitter locked down and the primary data node extracted. Now!" The Marines moved with the terrifying precision of a professional army. They ignored the wounded Elias and the terrified girls, focusing instead on the chrono key Kalith had slotted into the array. The Oryx High Exarch, however, walked straight toward Kalith. He stopped 3 meters away, his ears pinned back in a gesture of profound mourning and lethal intent. "Kalith Thorn," the Exarch spoke in the high dialect of their people, "you have found the man who silenced the general. You have found the ghost of Sector 4? Kalith didn't flinch. "I have found a father, Malachor, and I have found the bridges my father dreamed of." Malicor's gaze shifted to Lyra and Miri. His sapphire eyes widened as he sensed the resonance coming from the girls. The Star Kin. It is true then. The hegemony succeeded in their blasphemy. They have bound the Oryx soul to the Terran flesh. It's not blasphemy, Lyra shouted, stepping in front of Miri. It's us. We aren't experiments and we aren't bridges. We're Vances. Commander Vane stepped forward, her hard light arm flickering as she looked at the girls. Actually, Miss Vance, according to the emergency protocols of the neutral sectors, you are classified as high-value strategic assets recovered from an illegal research facility. You'll be coming with us to the core worlds for evaluation and protection. Elias felt a cold, familiar fury rising in his chest, a feeling more potent than the plasma burn. He struggled to his feet, leaning heavily on his Gauss rifle. The Marines instantly leveled their weapons at him. She's not a strategic asset, Vane, Elias growled, his ocular implant painting a tactical grid over the commander's face. She's my daughter, and if you think you're taking her to another lab, you're going to find out exactly why the hegemony spent 10 years trying to forget my name. Elias, stand down, Vane said, her voice softening slightly. Look at yourself. You're 60 seconds from going into shock. You're a war criminal by your own admission. The only reason I haven't put a bolt in your head is because the girls seem attached to you. But the galaxy needs to study them. If the Starkin can stop the next war, we have a moral obligation to... A moral obligation to steal their lives? Kalith interrupted, her fur standing on end. You are no better than the hegemony, Commander. You just have a prettier coat of paint on your ships. You see a weapon where you should see a second chance? Malicor stepped closer, his claws extending. The Oryx Council will take the children. They carry the essence of our ancestors. They will be raised in the sanctuaries of the White Flame, far from the reach of Terran greed. They aren't going to a sanctuary and they aren't going to a lab, Elias roared, the effort sending a spray of blood from his mouth. In that moment, the humanistic lesson he had tried to teach his daughters, that family is a choice, that loyalty is the only currency that matters, was being tested by the very people who claimed to be the good guys. The hegemony was easy to hate because their cruelty was honest. But the coalition, they were trying to steal the future in the name of the greater good. Miri stepped forward, her indigo light flaring with a sudden, violent intensity. The air around her began to hum, a low-frequency vibration that made the Marines' HUDs flicker and the accordance shields ripple. "Everyone stop!" Miri screamed. The sound wasn't just a voice, it was a physical wave of pressure that sent the Marines stumbling back. "I can hear all of you. You're all so loud. You want to study us. You want to pray to us. But not one of you has asked us what we want." She turned to Malicor, her eyes glowing with a terrifyingly ancient wisdom. "You want to take us because of our souls? My soul isn't Oryx. It isn't human. It's Miri, and Miri stays with her dad." She turned to Vane. "And you? You're afraid. You think if you don't control us, the war will start again. But the war is already here. It's inside you. You're so busy looking for a weapon that you've forgotten how to be people." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the wind seemed to die down. For a heartbeat, the greater good felt like a very small, very ugly thing. Then the station's proximity alarms let out a frantic, high-pitched scream. "Incoming!" Lyra yelled, pointing at the horizon. A massive fleet of hegemony jump ships was dropping out of orbit, hundreds of them. Drax had been a pawn, a local overseer, but the hegemony board of directors had realized that the broadcast was a death knell. They weren't coming for the girls anymore. They were coming to glass the North Pole. If they couldn't own the Starkin, no one would. "Orbital bombardment signatures detected." Vane's voice lost its diplomatic edge and returned to combat mode. "They're targeting the entire sector. Malicor, we have to bug out now." "The children!" Malicor shouted. "There's no time!" Vane grabbed Miri by the arm, her hard light hand clamping down with crushing force. "Move! Into the frigate!" Elias didn't think. He didn't calculate the odds. He swung the butt of his Gauss rifle, smashing it into Vane's prosthetic arm. The hard light shattered into a shower of blue sparks, and the commander let out a cry of pain, releasing Miri. "Get to the rover!" Elias barked at his daughters. "Kalith, the tunnels, the old mines under the ice cap." "What about you, Dad?" Lyra screamed as the first kinetic slug from orbit slammed into the ice fields 3 kilometers away, creating a massive, white and rust explosion. "I'll be right behind you," Elias lied, grabbing a bandolier of EMP grenades. "I have to buy you 10 minutes to clear the blast radius. Now move! That's an order!" As Lyra and Miri were swept away by Kaleith toward the ventilation shaft, Elias turned to face the sky. The Coalition Marines were scrambling back to their fast ropes, their moral mandate evaporating in the face of a real fight. Vane looked at Elias, her arm reforming in a stuttering blue light, her eyes filled with a sudden, sharp realization of what she was leaving behind. "You're a fool, Vance," she yelled as the rope pulled her upward. "You're staying for a ghost." "No," Elias whispered as the sky began to rain fire. "I'm staying for a second chance." He turned toward the high relay's control console. He didn't have much time. The first wave of orbital fire was designed to strip the shields. The second would turn the permafrost into glass. He began to type, his fingers moving with the cold, geometric precision of the strategist. He wasn't broadcasting files this time. He was rerouting the station's cooling vanes to act as a massive, improvised shield emitter. It would burn the station to the ground, but for 10 minutes, it would create a pocket of safety for the girls and the Oryx woman. The cost was his life. The ledger was finally going to be balanced. As the first direct hit slammed into the spire, throwing Elias across the room, he saw a flicker of movement in the shadows. It was Malachor. The Oryx High Exarch hadn't retreated. He was standing by the door, watching Elias with those sapphire eyes. "Why?" Malachor asked, the word resonant even over the thunder of the bombardment. "You are a butcher. Why die for a future you will not see?" Elias sat up, coughing blood, his hand finding the trigger for the shield surge. "Because it's the only thing I have left to fix, Malachor. Now get out of here. Tell them they're more than bridges." Malachor bowed, a deep, ancient gesture of respect that transcended species and war. Then he vanished into the smoke. Elias pressed the button. The high relay let out a sound like a dying god, a roar of blue energy that erupted from the cooling vanes, forming a shimmering dome over the North Pole. Above, the hegemony's fire hit the dome and broke, a million sparks cascading across the indigo sky. Elias slumped against the console, his vision fading. The last thing he saw wasn't the fire or the stars. It was the memory of 2 little girls in a stasis pod, and the realization that his greatest strategy hadn't been a battle plan. It had been love. The world was a muffled echo of static and the rhythmic, hollow drip of melting ice. Elias Vance opened his eyes, but for a long moment, he didn't know if he was in the orbital trenches of Cygnus or the sublevels of the high relay. The air was thick with the scent of singed fur and ancient earth. Above him, the ceiling was a jagged arch of frozen silicate in black magnetic ore, shimmering with a faint, dying indigo light. He tried to move, and the world exploded into a symphony of white-hot needles. He let out a low, guttural groan, his hand instinctively going to his side. The plasma burn was still there, but it felt different, colder, as if the flesh had been replaced by a block of ice. "Don't try to sit up, strategist. The Weaver's quiet is the only thing holding your organs in place." Elias turned his head slowly. Kaleith was sitting by a small crackling fire made of scavenged insulation strips and dried desert reeds. Her silver fur was singed in places, and her left ear was notched, but her gold eyes were as sharp as ever. Beside her, Lyra and Miri were huddled under a single thermal blanket, their faces pale but their breathing steady. Where are we?" Elias rasped, his throat feeling like he had swallowed a handful of sand. "The ancient mines," Kaleith said, her voice a soothing lyric in the dark. "The shield surge you triggered bought us enough time to reach the sublevels before the spire collapsed. Malachor found us in the smoke. He carried you down." "Malachor?" Elias blinked, the memory of the Oryx High Exarch returning in fragments. "Why? He wanted the girls." "He saw a sacrifice he could not ignore," Kaleith replied, stirring the fire with a piece of scrap metal. "In our culture, the act of giving one's life for the young of another species is the highest form of Ancora, the living debt. He could not take the children by force after seeing the father offer his blood to shield them. He is gone now, back to the fleet to argue for our sovereignty. But he left a warning. Drax? Drax is dead. The coalition fleet pulverized his transport during the first wave of the bombardment. But the hegemony, they are not finished. They have declared Dust Anchor a lost sector. They are moving a world eater into orbit. They mean to crack the planet's crust to ensure the Starkin project is truly buried. Elias felt a cold weight settle in his gut. A world eater was a massive planet-mining engine designed to strip a world to its core in less than 72 hours. It was a tool of ultimate corporate greed, a weapon that left nothing but a field of rubble in its wake. How long? Elias asked. 10 hours until they reached the primary gravity well, Kayla said. But there is a sanctuary. My father spoke of it. An ancient oryx repository hidden deep within the sand sea. It is built from the same magnetic ore as the mist canyons. Not even a world eater's sensors can penetrate it. If we can reach the Vault of Whispers, we can survive the planet's destruction. The sand sea is 1,000 kilometers from here, Elias said, his tactical mind trying to run the numbers and coming up with nothing but zeros. We don't have a ship. We have a wounded man and 2 kids. We have more than that, Dad. Lyra stood up, her face streaked with soot but her eyes burning with a fierce, mechanical determination. She walked over to a pile of wreckage in the corner of the cave. In the dim light, Elias could see the remains of a hegemony patrol skiff, one of the units that had been caught in the shield surge. It was battered, its wings sheared off, but the reactor was still humming with a faint, defiant green light. I've been stripping the hover drives and patching them into the harvester's chassis we dragged down here, Lyra said, her hands moving with a speed that blurred. It won't be pretty, and it's going to ride like a brick, but it'll get us across the dunes if we don't hit any major sinkholes. Elias looked at his eldest daughter. She wasn't just a mechanic anymore. She was a survivalist, a strategist in her own right. She had taken the lessons of the dirt and the grease and forged them into a lifeline. Lyra, Elias started, his voice thick with emotion. Save the "I'm proud of you" speech for when we aren't about to be turned into space dust, Dad, Lyra said, wiping a smudge of oil onto her forehead. Just stay alive. Miri is doing everything she can to keep your heart beating. Don't make her work go to waste. Miri was sitting at the edge of the fire, her eyes closed. She looked exhausted, her usual vibrant indigo glow dimmed to a flickering candlelight. She was humming, a low rhythmic song that vibrated in the floor of the cave. Elias could feel the resonance in his own bones, a soothing frequency that seemed to knit his shattered nerves back together. The song of the earth, Kaleth whispered. She is talking to the planet, Elias. She is asking the dust to hide us. Is that even possible? Elias asked. For a starkin? Anything is possible, Kaleth said. They are the first beings in the galaxy who can feel the static of both worlds. To Miri, the planet isn't a rock. It's a conversation. And right now, the conversation is full of fear. As the hours ticked away, the group worked in a desperate, synchronized frenzy. Lyra finished the improvised sandcrawler, a monstrous-looking vehicle composed of harvester plates and skiff engines. Miri continued her vigil, her song growing louder as the ground began to tremble with the first signs of the World Eater's arrival in orbit. Elias sat on the edge of the crawler, his rifle across his knees. He felt a strange, terrifying sense of clarity. For 10 years, he had believed that the cost of his second chance was a life of isolation and penance. He had thought that by staying hidden, he was protecting the girls from the monster he used to be. But looking at Lyra's grease-stained hands and Miri's unwavering song, he realized he had been wrong. The cost of a second chance wasn't silence. It was action. It was the willingness to be the monster one last time, so the next generation didn't have to be. We're ready, Lyra announced, climbing into the pilot's seat. Kaleth, you're on navigation. Miri, stay in the back with Dad. If the crawler starts to overheat, I need you to... I don't know. Talk to the engines? Tell them to be cool? I'll try, Lyra, Miri said with a small, brave smile. They roared out of the cave just as the first massive gravity anchor from the World Eater slammed into the North Pole. The impact sent a shockwave through the permafrost that nearly flipped the crawler. Behind them, the high relay station vanished into a massive sinkhole of churning ice and fire. The journey across the glass plains was a nightmare of shifting silica and falling stars. The hegemony was beginning its strip mining procedure, firing massive thermal beams into the planet's crust to loosen the ore. The sky was a chaotic mess of orange fire and black smoke, the stars vanishing once again behind the clouds of a dying world. "Thermal bloom at 2 o'clock, Kalis shouted, pointing to a massive pillar of fire erupting from the dunes. "Lyra, hard left. The crust is fracturing." "I see it! I see it!" Lyra wrestled with the crawler's controls, the skiff engines screaming in protest as they pushed the heavy vehicle through the deep sand. Elias watched the horizon through his ocular implant. He saw the ghost wraiths from the plains, the scavengers who had been touched by Mary's quiet. They weren't hiding anymore. They were standing on the ridges of the dunes, their glowing sensors turned toward the crawler. As they passed, the wraiths raised their vibro spears in a silent salute. A brotherhood of the discarded, watching the last hope of Dust Anchor flee the fire. "Why aren't they running?" Mary asked, her voice trembling as she watched the wraiths disappear into the smoke. "They have nowhere to go, Mary," Elias said, his heart breaking for the people he had spent 10 years ignoring. "They're part of the planet now. They're going down with the ship." "No," Mary whispered. "They don't have to." She stood up in the back of the crawler, her hair whipping in the wind. She closed her eyes and began to sing. Not a song of quiet this time, but a song of command. The indigo light erupted from her body in a blinding wave, washing over the crawler and the surrounding dunes. "Mary, stop! You'll burn out!" Elias screamed, reaching for her. But Mary didn't stop. She reached out her hands and the ghost dust on the ground began to rise. It didn't just swirl, it formed into massive, shimmering wings that surrounded the crawler, lifting it off the sand. The vehicle began to glide, not on engines but on the very resonance of the planet. "She's weaving the dust!" Kalith cried, her eyes wide with awe. "She's creating a magnetic corridor!" The crawler accelerated, moving with a speed that defied physics. They blurred across the glass plains, the fire of the hegemony's beams missing them by mere meters as Mary's corridor deflected the thermal energy. They reached the edge of the sand sea just as the World Eater began its primary descent. The ground beneath them was no longer trembling, it was liquefying. "There, the pillars of the ash!" Kalith pointed to a group of massive black stone monoliths rising from the dunes. "The vault is between them. Lyra, push it to the limit. Engines are at 400%. They're going to blow." "Do it!" Elias roared. The crawler slammed into the side of the monolith, Mary's dust wings shattering upon impact. They tumbled through a hidden entrance, the vehicle rolling over and over until it crashed into a cavern of ancient, carved stone. Silence. Elias crawled out of the wreckage, his side bleeding again, his vision swimming. He looked around. The Vault of Whispers was a cathedral of black magnetic ore, its walls covered in glowing oryx runes that pulsed with a steady, peaceful light. The air was cool and smelled of rain. Real rain, like the forests of the oryx homeworld. He looked for his daughters. Lyra was slumped over the wheel, unconscious but breathing. Mary was lying on the floor of the vault, her skin pale, the indigo light completely gone. "Mary!" Elias scrambled to her side, his heart hammering in terror. He pulled her into his lap, his tears hitting her cold cheek. "Mary, wake up! Please, baby! You did it! We're safe! Wake up!" Kalith knelt beside them, her hand resting on Mary's forehead. She stayed silent for a long moment, her ears twitching as she listened to the girl's heartbeat. "She is not gone, Elias," Kalith said softly. "She is just sleeping. She gave everything to the planet, and the planet is giving it back. She is dreaming of the rain." Elias let out a sob of relief, burying his face in Mary's hair. Outside, the World Eater began its work. The Vault of Whispers groaned under the pressure of the planet's crust being torn apart, but the magnetic ore held. The runes on the walls flared, creating a shield of ancient logic that the hegemony's machines couldn't touch. As the world above turned into a field of rubble and fire, Elias Vance sat in the dark, holding his daughters. He thought of the war, the massacre at Cygnus, and the decade of guilt he had carried like a shroud. He realized then that forgiveness wasn't something you waited for. It was something you built, with grease and song and the willingness to stand in the fire for someone else. The long war was finally over. The planet was gone, But the bridge was still standing. And as Elias watched the runes pulse in the silence, he knew that when they finally walked out of the vault, they wouldn't be survivors. They would be the architects of a galaxy that had finally learned how to breathe. He leaned his head back against the black stone, his eyes closing. For the first time in 10 long years, the strategist wasn't looking for an exit. He was home. "You did well, Elias Vance," Kalith whispered, her hand finding his. "Your father would have been proud." "My father was a soldier," Elias murmured, drifting into a peaceful sleep. "I'm just a dad." And in the silence of the vault of whispers, the dreams of the star kin began to weave a new map of the stars. A map where the lines weren't drawn in blood, but in the shimmering, defiant light of a second chance. The silence inside the vault of whispers was not a void. It was a physical weight, a pressurized stillness that felt like being submerged in deep, sunless water. Above them, the world-mining engines of the iron orbit hegemony were systematically dismantling the tectonic plates of dust anchor. But down here, nestled within the magnetic embrace of the black ore, the violence felt like a distant, muffled heartbeat. Elias Vance lay on the cold stone floor, his breathing a shallow, rhythmic rasp that seemed too loud in the cathedral-like space. His side was a landscape of cooling fire, the blue medical gel having hardened into a translucent shell over the plasma scorch. Every time he shifted, the ghost dust embedded in the vault's walls flared with a sympathetic indigo pulse, as if the very rock was counting his heartbeats. "You're ghosting out again, Dad. Stay with us." Lyra's voice was a sharp tether. She was kneeling beside him, her face a mask of grease and dried blood. She had managed to salvage a thermal welder from the wreckage of their improvised crawler and was currently using it to fuse a structural support for Miri's makeshift bed. "I'm here, junk jockey," Elias grunted, the old military slang slipping out like a reflex. "Just checking the internal sensors. Feels like the world just lost a few million tons of ballast." "It did," Kalith said, emerging from the shadows of the vault's deeper recesses. Her silver fur was matted, and her golden eyes carried a haunted, thousand-yard stare. She held a small, glowing orb, an ancient Oryx navigation core. "The World Eater has breached the secondary mantle. Dust Anchor is no longer a planet. It is a collection of floating islands held together by gravity anchors. We are currently sitting on a piece of debris roughly 10 kilometers wide." Elias closed his eyes for a heartbeat, mapping the tactical disaster in his mind. So we're sector wash. No ship, no atmosphere beyond the vault's scrubbers, and a hegemony fleet sitting in orbit waiting to pick through the scrap. "Not entirely sector wash," Lyra countered, pointing the welder toward the center of the vault. As his vision adjusted, Elias saw what his daughter had found. Buried beneath a layer of crystalline dust was the silhouette of something that didn't belong in a repository. It was a needle-shaped vessel, its hull composed of the same iridescent magnetic ore as the vault walls. It lacked traditional thrusters or intake manifolds. Instead, it possessed long, gossamer veins that looked like the wings of a dragonfly. "A star sail," Kalith whispered, her voice thick with reverence. "My father spoke of them in the Weaver Scrolls. They do not burn fuel. They ride the magnetic currents of the galaxy like a predator rides the wind. It has been dormant for 3 centuries, waiting for a star kin to wake the song." Elias looked toward Miri. His youngest daughter was still asleep, her skin pale and devoid of its usual indigo glow. She looked so small against the backdrop of ancient, forgotten technology. The guilt he had carried for 10 years, the weight of the 3,000 lives at Oak Haven, suddenly shifted. It wasn't just about his sins anymore. It was about the fact that he had brought these girls into a universe that viewed their existence as a commodity. "She gave too much to the storm, Kalith," Elias said, his voice cracking. "She's tapped. If we try to plug her into that ship, it'll drain the rest of her life force just to clear the debris field." "She won't be alone, Elias," Kalith replied, kneeling beside him. She took his calloused hand, her claws retracted, her touch surprisingly warm. "The star kin are bridges, yes, but every bridge needs an anchor. You are the reason they survived the labs. You are the reason they know how to love. That connection, it is a frequency of its own." Lyra stood up, tossing the welder aside. "We don't have time for a prayer meeting. I've looked at the star sail's interface. It's bio-locked. It needs 2 signatures to engage the primary sail. 1 Oryx, 1 Terran. It was designed for a peace that never happened. A second chance, Elias murmured, the humanistic theme he had tried to bury, finally forcing its way to the surface. He had spent 10 years thinking his second chance was the farm, the isolation, the quiet. He was wrong. His second chance was the opportunity to be the man General Thorne thought he was, a man who could choose a future over a battle plan. All right, Elias said, the stiffness in his joints vanishing under a surge of synthetic adrenaline. Lyra, get the crawler's power cell. We're going to jump-start the life support on that needle. Calith, prep the navigation. We're going to board that world eater. Board it? Calith blinked. That is suicide, even for the ghost of Sector 4. The hegemony thinks we're dead, Elias said, his eyes hardening into the cold, geometric precision of the strategist. They'll be focused on the mining data in the core extraction. Their internal security will be on low alert. If we can get onto the command deck, we don't just broadcast the truth, we seize the World Eater's transmission array. We don't just tell the galaxy what happened, we show them the star-kin living and breathing, we make them impossible to ignore. And then, Lyra asked, her jaw set, and then we give them a choice, Elias said. The same choice I had to make at Cygnus. Do they want to be soldiers for a corporation, or do they want to be part of something that finally learns how to breathe? The next 3 hours were a blur of frantic technical labor. Lyra worked like a woman possessed, her hybrid intuition allowing her to feel the ancient circuits of the star sail. She didn't use manuals. She used her hands, sensing the flow of energy like a pulse. Miri woke up as the ship began to hum, her indigo glow returning in soft, flickering waves. She didn't speak, but she walked to the star sail and pressed her forehead against the iridescent hull. The ship let out a low harmonic chime, a sound of 300 years of loneliness finally finding a voice. She's ready, Dad, Miri whispered, her eyes wide and clear. The ship says it's tired of waiting for the sun. They boarded the vessel, the interior feeling more like a living organism than a machine. There were no chairs, only recessed pods lined with sensory moss. Elias settled into the primary pod, the interface tendrils gently wrapping around his scarred arms. He felt a sharp, electric sting as the ship sampled his DNA, followed by a rush of data that made his ocular implant scream with white noise. Calith, engage the Oryx link, Elias commanded. Calith pressed her palms against the navigator's console. The star sail's gossamer wings extended, piercing through the vault's roof as if it were made of paper. The ship didn't roar. It vanished. They were no longer in the vault. They were a streak of shimmering light, darting between the massive, floating chunks of Dust Anchor's shattered crust. High above, the World Eater loomed, a moon-sized monstrosity of steel and greed, its massive mining maw still glowing with the heat of the planet's destruction. Hegemony cruisers at 12 o'clock, Lyra shouted, her mind linked to the ship's tactical sensors. They've spotted the magnetic wake. They're launching interceptors. Ignore them, Elias ordered, his vision now a 360-degree tactical sphere. Miri, focus on the World Eater's shield harmonics. Find the gap where the mining lasers cycle. I see it, Miri said, her voice sounding ancient and resonant. It's a heartbeat, Dad, deep and slow. Every 42 seconds, the shield gate opens for the thermal venting. If we time it right, we can ghost in. The star sail danced through a hail of plasma fire, its magnetic hull refracting the beams into harmless sprays of light. They moved with a fluid, organic grace that made the Hegemony's ships look like clumsy, prehistoric beasts. As they neared the World Eater's primary docking pylon, the shield gate began to shimmer. Now, Elias roared. The star sail folded its wings and dived. They punched through the shield wall just as the thermal vent let out a roar of superheated gas. The ship tumbled through a forest of massive conduits and cooling towers, the moss in the pods tightening to absorb the G-force. With a jarring metallic thud, they slammed into the World Eater's internal landing bay, a cavernous space filled with hundreds of heavy cargo shuttles and mining drones. Elias kicked his way out of the moss pod, his Gauss rifle already in his hands. He felt the transformation beginning, not the cold, detached hunger of the soldier, but a fierce, protective heat. He was done being a victim of his history. He was done asking for forgiveness from the dead. Lyra, Miri, stay close to Calith, Elias commanded as the bay's alarms began to wail. We have 1,000 meters of corridor between us and the command deck. If it moves and it's wearing a hegemony badge, put it down. But remember what Mary said. We aren't here to be their monsters. We're here to be their wake-up call. Copy that, Dad, Lyra said, her pulse pistol humming. Let's go breach this tin can. They moved out of the bay, a small, defiant group of 4 against a crew of 5,000. The long war had reached its final sector, and as Elias Vance led his daughters into the heart of the enemy's power, he realized that for the first time in 45 years, he didn't care about the casualty rates. He only cared about the 2 girls who had taught him that even a strategist could find his way home. The corridors of the World Eater, the Maw of Avarice, were a stark contrast to the organic warmth of the Star Sail. Here everything was sharp angles, cold steel, and the sterile, recycled scent of filtered oxygen and desperation. The walls were lined with flickering screens, displaying quotas of refined silicate and the fluctuating market values of the ghost dust. To the iron orbit hegemony, the destruction of a world was not a tragedy. It was a line item on a quarterly report. Elias Vance led the way, his boots silent on the deck plates. His ocular implant was working in overdrive, filtering the ship's internal security grid to show the positions of the overseer squads. They had made it 300 meters into the secondary superstructure before the first heavy contact occurred. 2 squads of enforcers rounding the corner at 70 meters, Elias hissed, dropping to one knee behind a stack of shipping crates. Lyra, EMP burst on my mark. Caleth, prepare a thermal lash. Ready, Dad, Lyra whispered, her fingers fumbling with a modified pulse capacitor. Mark! A blinding sphere of blue-white energy erupted in the center of the corridor. The enforcers' HUDs short-circuited, their armor servos locking with a screech of protesting metal. Before they could reset their systems, Caleth was among them, a blur of silver fur and golden fire. She didn't use a blade. She used the very heat of her oryx physiology, her hands glowing as she touched the enforcers' breastplates, fusing the electronics and sending them into a painless stasis. Ilias watched her move, a lethal lyricism that reminded him of the warriors he had fought on Tantalus. But Caleth wasn't killing. She was neutralizing. She was following the silent lead of Miri, who stood in the center of the chaos, her indigo light acting as a dampening field that prevented the enforcers from feeling the surge of adrenaline-fueled rage. Move! Elias barked, reloading his gas rifle. They breached the primary lift gate, the heavy doors groaning as Lyra bypassed the security shunts. As they ascended toward the command deck, the ship began to shudder. The World Eater was finishing its primary core extraction, the massive gravity anchors pulling the very soul of Dust Anchor into its storage bays. They're almost done, Miri said, her eyes fixed on the ceiling. I can hear the planet, Dad. It's going quiet. It's giving up. Not yet, it isn't, Elias said, his voice hard. We're 90 seconds from the bridge. Caleth, the data shard, is it ready? It is, Caleth said, holding the hexagonal crystal. The decryption is complete. Once we plug this into the primary array, every ship in the sector will see the faces of the children the hegemony tried to turn into ghosts. The lift doors hissed open, and they stepped into the lion's den. The command deck of the Maw of Avarice was a vast, circular amphitheater of glass and light. In the center sat the architect, Director Sterling, a man who had spent 60 years turning human and oryx lives into wealth. He didn't look like a soldier. He looked like a grandfather, his hair perfectly white, his suit a masterpiece of core world silk. He didn't turn around when they entered. He was watching the holographic projection of Dust Anchor's core being pulverized. You have a remarkable capacity for survival, Elias Vance, Sterling said, his voice calm and melodic. The ghost of Sector 4. I always wondered why you chose to disappear. You were our most promising strategist. You understood the cold equations of power better than anyone. I understood the cost, Sterling, Elias said, leveling his rifle at the director's head. And I'm here to tell you the bill is overdue. The remaining Overseer guards, 40 of them, clad in heavy chrono armor, leveled their weapons at Elias's group. The air in the room became thick with the hum of high-yield energy cells. Sterling finally turned his chair, his eyes fixed on Lyra and Miri. The Starkin. Beautiful. Even in this lighting, the resonance is unmistakable. You think you're saving them, Elias? You're condemning them. The galaxy is a hungry place. If they aren't protected by the hegemony's labs, they'll be hunted by every petty warlord and privateer from here to the rim. We are the only ones who can ensure their potential isn't wasted. Their potential isn't yours to decide, Lyra shouted, her pulse pistol aimed at a reactor conduit. We're people, you piece of sector trash. We aren't assets. Sterling smiled, a thin, cold expression. A person is just a data point that hasn't been properly categorized yet, my dear. Elias, stand down. You know how this ends. Look at the tactical grid. You're outnumbered, outgunned, and the orbital fleet will be here in 3 minutes. Give us the children, and I'll ensure you have a comfortable retirement in a core world medical facility. We can even fix that side wound of yours. Elias felt the pain in his side flare, a reminder of his mortality. He looked at Sterling, then at the overseers, then at his daughters. The strategist in him was running the numbers, and for the first time in his life, the casualty rate was 100%. If he pulled the trigger, they all died. If he surrendered, the girls were lost to the labs. It was the crucial decision, the moment where the lesson he had taught his daughters had to be lived by him. You're right, Sterling, Elias said, his voice dropping to a whisper. The galaxy is a hungry place, and for 45 years, I've been the one feeding it. I've killed for the greater good. I've signed orders that burned cities. I've been the monster because I thought it was the only way to protect the people I loved. He slowly lowered his Gauss rifle, the barrel pointing toward the floor. Dad, what are you doing? Miri cried, her indigo light flickering. But I realize now, Elias continued, ignoring his daughter's plea, that you don't stop a war by being a better killer. You stop it by being a better bridge. Sterling, you think everything has a price. But my daughters, they're the one thing in this galaxy that is infinite. They aren't a weapon. They're a second chance for all of us. Even for you. Elias reached out and took Mary's hand. He felt the soft, pulsing warmth of the Starkin energy. He looked at Kaleth and nodded. Kaleth, the data. Now! Kaleth didn't plug the shard into the array. She threw it to Miri. Miri, sing, Kaleth commanded. Don't talk to the ship. Talk to them. All of them. Miri caught the crystal. She closed her eyes and her indigo light flared with a sudden, blinding brilliance that filled the entire command deck. The ghost dust in the ship's vents began to glow, responding to her resonance. The Enforcer's chrono armor began to vibrate, the temporal fields buckling under the weight of her empathy. Miri didn't broadcast a file, she broadcast a feeling. The command deck was suddenly flooded with the collective memories of the Starkin. The fear of the labs, the warmth of the Vance farm, the smell of the grease in the workshop, and the profound, unwavering love of a father who had chosen them. The Enforcers froze, their hands shaking as they were forced to feel the humanity of the assets they were hunting. Director Sterling stumbled back, his hands covering his eyes as the cold equations of his mind were shattered by a tidal wave of raw, unoptimized emotion. He saw the faces of the children he had categorized as data. He felt the weight of every world he had cracked. Stop it, Sterling screamed. Seal the array. Cut the power. But it was too late. The resonance had already jumped the World Eater's transmission lines. It was spreading through the fleet, through the sector, through every relay on Dust Anchor. The truth wasn't a file anymore. It was an experience. Elias walked toward Sterling, his rifle still lowered. He didn't see an enemy. He saw a man who had forgotten how to be an anchor. The long war is over, Sterling, Elias said, his voice resonant with Miri's quiet. You can't sell a war to a galaxy that's finally learned how to feel the pain of the casualty list. Your hegemony is done. The World Eater groaned, a sound of massive systems failing. The gravity anchors began to reverse, the silicate core of Dust Anchor flowing back toward the planet's mantle. The ship was dying, its artificial purpose consumed by the Starkin's song. We have to go, Dad, Lyra yelled, grabbing his arm. The reactor's going critical. The star sail is our only way out. Elias looked at Sterling, who was slumped on the floor, his eyes wide and vacant, his silk suit covered in glowing ghost dust. The transformation was painful, a man of logic suddenly forced to live in a world of feeling. Leave him, Kaleth said, her hand on Elias's shoulder. He has been judged by the only court that matters, his own soul. They ran for the star sail, the World Eater's corridors now filled with enforcers who had removed their helmets, their faces wet with tears they couldn't explain. No one fired a shot, No one barred their way. The ghost of Sector 4 walked through the heart of the enemy's power, and all he saw were people. They boarded the needle ship and detached just as the maw of avarice began to fracture. The massive vessel didn't explode. It simply came apart, its components drifting away like scrap in the wind. As the star sail caught the magnetic currents of the sector, Elias Vance looked back at the remains of Dust Anchor. The planet was a collection of floating, green and indigo islands, the ghost dust forming a shimmering atmosphere that protected the people below. The neutral sector's fleet was holding its position, their weapons cold, their commanders silent. The bridge was open. Elias slumped into his moss pod, the exhaustion finally claiming him. He looked at Lyra, who was already analyzing the ship's telemetry, and Miri, who was staring out at the stars with a peaceful smile. He looked at Kalith, the daughter of the man he had killed, and saw not a ghost, but a sister in arms. "We made it, strategist," Kalith whispered. "No," Elias said, his eyes closing. "We didn't make it. We built it." For 45 years, Elias Vance had been a man shaped by the scars of his past. But as the star sail carried them toward the core worlds, toward a future he couldn't predict but was no longer afraid of, he realized that the ledger wasn't balanced. It was something better. It was a blank page. And for the first time in his life, he didn't need a battle plan to know what to write. He just needed to be a father. The long war was truly over. The silence of the galaxy was finally at peace. And as the ghost of Sector 4 faded into history, Elias Vance finally learned how to breathe. The star sail did not fly through the void so much as it rippled across the magnetic currents of the sector, its gossamer veins catching the unseen breath of the stars. Behind them, the once solid marble of Dust Anchor had been transformed into a glittering archipelago of floating islands, held together by the stubborn gravity anchors the World Eater had left behind. The ghost dust, now permanently supercharged, formed a soft, violet aurora that wrapped around the debris like a protective shroud. It was a beautiful, broken sight, a monument to a world that had died so a future could be born. Elias Vance sat in his sensory pod, the moss-like interface pulsing with a dull, rhythmic light. His side was a numb, icy weight. The ship's medical systems were working in tandem with the weaver's touch that Miri had left behind, knitting his flesh together with a strange, bioluminescent thread. He watched the displays of the neutral coalition fleet. They were no longer in battle formation. They were circling the remains of Dust Anchor like scavengers, or perhaps like witnesses. "Dad? You still sector wash, or are you back with us?" Lyra's voice was the first thing that pulled him out of the gray fog of exhaustion. She was leaning over his pod, her face finally free of grease, though her eyes were rimmed with a deep, red fatigue. She looked older than 18. She looked like a woman who had seen the end of one galaxy and the beginning of another. "I'm here, kid," Elias rasped, his voice sounding like dry leaves skittering on pavement. "Just calculating the drift. Where are we?" "We're holding station near the third shard," Lyra said, gesturing to the viewports. "The coalition bridge comms haven't stopped screaming for 3 hours. They want to know where we're going. They want to know what Miri did. They're calling it the Indigo event." "Let them call it whatever they want," Elias said, struggling to sit up, "as long as they don't call it property." He looked past her and saw Miri. The girl was standing at the very tip of the needle ship, her forehead pressed against the transparent hull. She was silent, but her indigo glow was no longer a frantic flare. It was a steady, warm amber light that seemed to mirror the gold eyes of the oryx. Beside her stood Kalith, her silver fur catching the light of the nebula outside. They were two different species, born of war and science, yet in the silence of the cockpit, they looked like two branches of the same tree. "The fleet is afraid," Kayla said, her voice resonant and clear. She did not turn around, but her ears twitched as Elias approached. "I can feel their static even from here. The commanders are arguing about the security implications of a child who can talk to planets. They are wondering if the Starkin are a gift or a new category of threat." "They're people, Kalith," Elias said, leaning heavily against the bulkhead. "The moment we let them be categorized as anything else, the war starts again." "The war never truly stops, strategist," Kalith replied, finally turning to face him. "It only changes its vocabulary. But you have done something even my father could not. You didn't just save the bridges. You taught them how to stand. You gave them a father who was willing to burn his own name to keep them in the sun. Elias looked at his hands, scarred, calloused, and stained with the memory of 1,000 triggers pulled. He thought about Oak Haven. He thought about the 3,000 lives he had ended with a single authorization. For 10 years, he had carried that debt like a lead weight, believing that his only path to redemption was to hide in the dirt and wait for the end. I didn't do it for the galaxy, Elias confessed, his voice low. I did it because I was tired of being a strategist. I was tired of the numbers. I just wanted to be a man who could look his daughters in the eye without seeing a casualty list. A sharp chime interrupted them. It was a priority override signal from the Coalition flagship, the Accordant. Commander Vane's face appeared on the holographic display, her hard light arm flickering with a jagged, unstable blue. She looked shaken, the professional mask of the soldier having been eroded by the memory transmission Miri had broadcast. Elias Vance, Vane said, her voice lacking its previous authority. The Coalition Council has issued an emergency mandate. They're demanding that the Star Kin be brought to the hub for a full diplomatic inquiry. They're offering a full pardon for your past engagements if you cooperate. They say they want to ensure a peaceful transition for the sector. Elias let out a short, dry laugh. A peaceful transition. That's a pretty way of saying they want to put my kids in a gold-plated cage. Tell the council that the ghost of Sector 4 is done taking orders from the brass. Elias, be reasonable, Vane pleaded. The hegemony might be fractured, but their remnants are still out there. You're one ship against 1,000 interests. You can't protect them alone. He's not alone, Commander. Calith stepped into the frame of the holographic camera, her gold eyes burning with an ancient, terrifying pride. The Oryx High Exarch Malachor has already reached the neutral sector's border. He is not alone either. The clans of the White Flame are mobilizing. We do not recognize your council's mandate. Dust Anchor is no longer a resource farm for your corporations. It is a sanctuary. And these children, they are the guardians of that sanctuary. Vane looked from Calith to Elias, then at the two girls standing defiantly in the background. She sighed, a long, weary sound that echoed through the ship. The galaxy isn't going to let this go, Elias. You've opened a door that can't be shut. Good, Elias said. Maybe now they'll have to learn how to walk through it. He cut the transmission, and the hologram faded into a swirl of blue static. The ship was silent once more, save for the low hum of the magnetic currents. Elias felt a sudden, sharp clarity. The transformation he had undergone wasn't a sudden epiphany. It was a slow, painful shedding of skin. He had spent 45 years as a strategist, a man who mapped out death to find the path to victory. But as he looked at the floating islands of Dust Anchor, he realized that true victory didn't look like a surrender treaty. It looked like a garden. What do we do now, Dad? Miri asked, walking over to him. She took his hand, her small fingers interlocking with his. Where do we go? Elias looked at Lyra, who was already sketching a blueprint for an atmospheric stabilizer for the floating shards. He looked at Calith, who was watching the horizon with the gaze of a sister in arms. Then he looked at Miri, the bridge that had saved them all. We go home, Elias said. Not to the farm, to the shards. There's a lot of work to do if we're going to make that sanctuary real. We have to teach the people how to live without the hegemony. We have to show the Oryx and the humans how to share the same air. We have to build something that doesn't need a gun to stay standing. You're a strategist, Dad, Lyra teased, a faint smile returning to her grease-stained face. What's the battle plan? Elias knelt down, ignoring the protest from his healing side. He looked at his daughters, his heart finally feeling as though the lead weight had been replaced by a quiet, steady flame. No more battle plans, Lyra, Elias said. From now on, we're builders, and the first thing we're going to build is a place where no one ever has to hide their fur or their soul ever again. The starsail banked, its dragonfly wings catching the light of the nebula. It turned away from the Coalition fleet and dived toward the floating islands of the North Pole. As the ship descended into the violet aurora, Elias Vance realized that his second chance hadn't been a gift from the universe. It had been an invitation, and for the first time in 10 long years, he was ready to accept. The aftermath of the broadcast continued to ripple through the sector like a solar wind. On the core worlds, the iron orbit hegemony stocks plummeted to zero as the truth of the Starkin project and the Oak Haven massacre was aired on every public terminal. In the fringe, the miners and the sector rats began to realize that the monsters they had been taught to hate were actually the victims of the same machine that had ground them down for decades. The vocabulary of the war was indeed changing, replaced by words like accountability, restitution, and solidarity. But for Elias Vance, sitting on a piece of floating obsidian 5 kilometers above the surface of what used to be a desert, the aftermath was much smaller and much more profound. It was the taste of fresh water from an atmospheric condenser that didn't rattle. It was the sound of Miri's laughter as she played among the glowing desert reeds with an oryx kit who had been orphaned by the World Eater. It was the sight of Lyra and Malachor arguing over the wiring of a gravity anchor, their species' difference forgotten in the face of a shared mechanical problem. Ilias leaned back against the warm rock, the twin suns of the new dust anchor rising over the horizon. He looked at his hands. They were still scarred, but for the first time in 45 years, they didn't feel like weapons. They felt like tools. And as the ghost of Sector 4 watched the dawn of a new era, he finally understood the secret that General Thorne had tried to tell him at Cygnus. That courage wasn't the ability to pull a trigger. It was the strength to let go of the gun. The settlement of the shards had grown from a desperate encampment into a thriving, vertical civilization in the 3 years since the fall of the iron orbit hegemony. What was once the North Pole of Dust Anchor was now a cluster of emerald and indigo islands drifting in a stable orbital dance, connected by a network of star sails and magnetic bridges. The ghost dust had become more than just fuel. It was the lifeblood of the shards, acting as a natural conduit for Miri's Weaver song, which kept the atmosphere breathable and the temperatures mild. Ilias Vance stood on the observation deck of the primary island, aptly named the Anchor. He was 48 years old now, and the stiffness in his gait had mostly vanished, replaced by the fluid, purposeful movement of a man who spent his days climbing scaffolding and tending to the gardens of the shards. His hair had gone entirely white, but his eyes were clear, the haunted look of the strategist replaced by a deep, contemplative peace. He was currently holding a hydrospanner, adjusting the pressure regulator on a community moisture condenser. It was a circular task, the same one he had been performing on the day Caliph arrived at his farm. But the meaning had been transformed. He wasn't fixing a dying lung in a wasteland anymore. He was ensuring the life flow of a community that had chosen to be a family. "Dad, the envoy from the neutral sectors is here. He says he won't land until he gets a personal assurance of safety from the hero of the shards." Lyra's voice drifted up from the landing gantry. She was 21 now, the chief engineer of the shards, her hybrid reflexes making her the most sought-after mechanic in the sector. She was wearing a sleek tactical suit of her own design, one that incorporated both human plating and oryx sensory weave. Elias wiped a smear of clean water from his brow. "Tell him he's safe, Lyra, as long as he doesn't try to buy anything that isn't for sale. And tell him to stop calling me a hero. It makes my skin itch." "He's bringing a proposal for a permanent trade treaty, Dad," Miri said, appearing beside him in a shimmer of indigo light. At 16, she was the spiritual heart of the shards, a high weaver who could calm an ion storm with a hum. She was taller than her sister, her movements possessing a regal oryx-like grace. "He says the coalition is ready to recognize our sovereignty. They want to open a diplomatic corridor between the core and the shards." Elias looked at his youngest daughter. She was no longer a bridge. She was the destination. "What do you think, Miri? You're the one who hears the song of the stars. Is the galaxy ready to play fair?" Miri closed her eyes for a heartbeat, her ears twitching. "The static is still there, Dad. Greed doesn't go away just because you break a corporation. But the song is louder. They're coming with curiosity this time, not just hunger. I think it's time we let them in." "All right," Elias said, setting the spanner down. "Lyra, prep the welcome gantry. Miri, get Caliph. If we're going to talk to an envoy, we move as a pack." The transformation of Elias Vance was most evident in that simple command. For the first 45 years of his life, his only tactic had been isolation. He had believed that safety was a wall you built between yourself and the world. But as he walked toward the landing gantry, he realized that the only true safety was the connection you built between yourself and others. He wasn't a protector because he had a rifle. He was a protector because he was an anchor for the people he loved. The envoy, a slender human male in a crisp, white diplomatic tunic, stepped off his transport with a mixture of awe and trepidation. He looked up at the floating islands, the shimmering ghost dust, and the hybrid children playing in the plaza, and he seemed to forget his rehearsed speech. "Mr. Vance," the envoy began, bowing low, "I am Ambassador Thorne. No relation to the general, I assure you." "A common name for an uncommon time," Elias said, offering a calloused hand. The ambassador took it, his eyes widening at the strength in Elias's grip. "Welcome to the Shards, Ambassador. I hear you have a treaty to discuss." "I do," the ambassador said, regaining his composure. "The coalition is prepared to offer you full representation on the Galactic Board, as well as a significant endowment for the Starkin integration program. We want to help you rebuild the galaxy in your image, Mr. Vance. We want you to lead us." Elias looked around the plaza. He saw Caliph standing with a group of Oryx elders, their silver fur gleaming in the twin suns. He saw Lyra laughing with a human pilot, her hands busy with a piece of machinery. He saw Miri singing a low, harmonic tune to a garden of fire lilies. "I appreciate the offer, Ambassador," Elias said, his voice resonant with a quiet authority. "But I think the galaxy has had enough of leaders like me. I'm a strategist. I know how to win wars. But these people, they're the ones who know how to live in the peace. If you want a treaty, you talk to the weavers and the builders. I'm just the guy who fixes the condensers." The ambassador looked stunned. "But your reputation, the ghost of Sector 4, the man who broke the hegemony? That man is dead, Ambassador," Elias said, a genuine smile touching his face. "He died in a stasis pod at Cygnus. The man standing in front of you is just a dad. And if you'll excuse me, I have a moisture condenser that needs calibrating before dinner." Elias turned and walked back toward the gardens, his heart feeling lighter than it ever had in the orbital trenches. He had spent his entire life mapping out the stars, looking for an exit, a way to escape the scars of his past. But as he watched Miri and Lyra run toward him, their laughter echoing across the floating islands, Elias Vance realized that he had finally found his coordinate. He wasn't a strategist anymore. He was a father. He wasn't a monster anymore. He was an anchor. And as the twin suns set over the shards, casting long, golden shadows across the archipelago, Elias Vance finally understood that the most important strategy in the galaxy wasn't a battle plan. It was the simple, revolutionary act of choosing to love what was right in front of you. The long war was truly over. The silence of the galaxy was finally at peace. And as the ghost of Sector 4 faded into the shimmering dust of history, Elias Vance finally learned how to breathe. "I spent 45 years of my life believing that a man was defined by the ghosts he carried. I walked the trenches of Tantalus and the moons of Cygnus with a map of every life I'd taken, etched into the back of my eyelids. I thought that by hiding in the dust of a fringe world, I was protecting my daughters from the shadow of the strategist. I thought the gun under my pillow was the only thing standing between them and a hungry universe. How wrong a man can be when he's blinded by his own guilt." Looking back at the journey from that moisture farm to these floating shards, I realize now that I wasn't protecting them at all. I was just refusing to let them see me bleed. I treated my family like a tactical objective, a mission to be accomplished through silence and isolation. But Caliph showed me that a scar isn't just a memory of a wound. It's proof that you were strong enough to heal. And Miri showed me that the only way to stop a war isn't to kill the enemy, but to realize that the enemy is just another person who's tired of being afraid. Humanity spent centuries trying to conquer the stars, trying to categorize every soul into a neat little box of species and value. We built machines like the World Eater to strip the universe of its mystery because we were terrified of what we couldn't own. But the Starkin, my daughters, they've shown us that the true power of the galaxy isn't in the profit of the mines, but in the resonance of the bridge. I am Elias Vance. I was a butcher, a ghost, and a strategist. But today, as I stand in the sun and watch my girls weave a new world out of the wreckage of the old, I realize that the most courageous thing I ever did wasn't standing before a rotary cannon. It was allowing myself to be forgiven. It was realizing that a second chance isn't something you earn. It's something you choose to live every single day, one breath at a time. For 45 years, I wore my guilt like a suit of armor, believing that if I let it go, I would be defenseless against the world I had helped break. I wonder, as you look at the maps of your own lives, what are the heavy things you've been carrying because you're afraid of who you might be without them? What would it look like if you finally decided that your mistakes were just the foundations for the things you're meant to build? Elias Vance set his wrench on the stone ledge and looked up at the shimmering indigo sky, where the stars were finally at peace. He took a deep, clear breath, the first one in 100 years, and turned toward the laughter of his home. The twin suns dipped below the horizon, and on the floating shards of dust anchor, the gardens began to glow with a light that had no need for a strategist.